Hello everybody, I'm glad to be here with you. I'm really actually honored to be here with you. Just starting with some disclosures about who I've done work with and the like. So this is just kind of the way I think about developing an AI model in terms of the various steps. But as I often say to my friends in computer science, this would be like if a poet tried to describe to you how your carburetor worked. Yeah, it would be beautiful, but it's not exactly going to help you to build the carburetor or to fix it if it breaks down on the side of the road. So this is how a lawyer and an ethicist thinks about the steps in building medical AI. And the reason I do it this way is because at each of the stages, I think there's some distinctive legal and ethical issues to be on the lookout first. So to begin with, it's about acquiring the data. Among the issues you have to think about is where is all of this data coming from? Do I have permission to use this data? Have I adequately stripped it of identifiers under HIPAA? If I'm governed by GDPR in Europe, how is that going to play out? How representative and diverse is the data set from which I'm drawing? Who's missing and what am I doing to take into account for that? And is it appropriate for the context that's deployed? And who's had a say in the fact that we're building this to begin with? So what kinds of governance do we have in place involving patients or other kinds of groups? The second phase is this idea of building and validating the model. And the question is, how do you know it's good enough to be used on your first actual real-life patient? What standard of validation is going to be in place? Are you going to be validating it inside? Do you need to look at an outside regulator to validate it? Is there third parties you're thinking about? And there are real tensions here between, on the one hand, protecting intellectual property and protecting these as viable commercial opportunities, especially in a world where algorithms typically are not themselves patentable, versus, on the other hand, promoting trustworthiness and giving patients and others, civil society, a reason to believe what you're providing them is actually going to be helpful and that people can take a look at it. A third phase is you're ready to test the model in real-world settings. What, if anything, do you have to tell patients before this AI is being used to help direct their care? Do they have the opportunity to opt out? Can they say, I don't want you to look at what the AI has recommended, or I don't want the AI's recommendation here? And does it matter if it's something that's like organ allocation, where in fact, if one person says no, that might affect the entire pool of what's being allocated? How are you going to handle questions about contextual bias? So AI trained in one setting, deployed in another setting. How do you know it's ready for your hospital or your implementation site? And which regulators are best fitted and best able to actually find the answers to these questions? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Finally, broad dissemination. You've got a model that's very successful and it's working for your patient population. Now the question is, who else can it help? And what obligations, ethically speaking, do you have to make sure it's reaching the users it can benefit, even if many of them are in resource-poor settings within the United States and elsewhere? So that's like a general roadmap. I'm now going to circle back to a few of these things and we can talk about more. The first one I want to just kind of start with is this overall question about what gets built and why, right? So I often say beyond prognostics, diagnostics, there's also the reason as to why you're doing this. You're spending a lot of money, a lot of person power to introduce artificial intelligence into your system. Why the heck are you doing this and spending your time and money on this? Well, there's a few possible answers. The one you will hear from Silicon Valley and the one with all the hype is that last box, pushing the frontiers. The idea of taking very good dermatologists, very good radiologists, and making them even better. The small number of cases they miss, we're going to try to plug that difference and actually improve their performance. And that's worthwhile to do. Hard to do, but worthwhile to do it. A lot of the money right now and a lot of the implementation we're actually seeing is what I call automating drudgery. That second box, right? Taking the time of really good physicians and freeing it up to actually deal with patients as opposed to dealing with billing or dealing with email or dealing with the like. But what I want to suggest is one of the biggest opportunities here is actually that first box, ethically speaking, democratizing expertise. Instead of making really good radiologists, really good oncologists even better, let's take mediocre oncologists and mediocre dermatologists and give the services they can give at scale to the entire world, to the entire United States, to India, to all sorts of places across the world. This is probably the biggest ticket ethical value of artificial intelligence, and yet for a number of reasons, it's not where all the resources are being put or all of the design. So as we talk about this, I just want to keep that in mind to say, when we're asking why are we doing this, is this consistent with the mission of our institution and our larger mission for people on this earth? Okay. I often talk to lawyers, and lawyers are very, some of you know, I'm sure, lawyers can be very persnickety and aggressive and know everythings, right? I myself am like this, I'm told often at the dinner table, right? But often when I say to them, I work on medical AI, I say, oh yeah, I know all about AI. I sit in driverless cars, and I kind of, use the computer and stuff like that. What's different about medical AI? And what I tell them is, as with everything else with medicine, it's just much more complicated because there's so many more people who have hands on what affects a patient's welfare. There is the designer of the AI, the developer, which could be co-developed within a health system, or it could be outside, right? Who's making all sorts of decisions from the training data, the basis of the algorithm, but also the choice architecture. How do you overrule or override the AI? How are alerts delivered? All these sorts of things, right? Beyond that person, right, there is potentially a regulator. It could be a pre-market regulator like an FDA. It could be actually a health systems regulator internally that's making a whole bunch of decisions about this. We have hospitals who are purchasers, and their purchasing decisions are going to affect how care is delivered and can be kind of in a way that furthers the goals of their physician and their workforce or contrapuntal to it, against it, going against the grain. And they're making a whole bunch of decisions which might be optimizing things like value, and their conception of value isn't just our patients getting better. There's a lot of other things that go into value, and they're making decisions about what they buy and why they buy it. There are insurers, both in terms of health insurer payers, so reimbursers, who are deciding things like, am I going to pay and how for the acquisition of this AI or for each use thereof, right? And am I going to make decisions about if the AI recommends a cheaper treatment than what the physician wants to do? Is that going to be relevant in my determinations about what to pay or in determining a prior authorization? And there are also malpractice insurers, right, who are going to make decisions that will cause certain decisions about adoption of AI depending on how much comfort hospital systems and physicians have that should something go wrong, they will be protected. And then finally, there's the physician. And the reason why I put it this way, and the whole care team as well, the reason I put it this way is because when you're trying to say what would be best, what's going to make safest for patients, what's going to further our goals, looking at one of these levels is challenging, but imagining how making a change at one of these levels will interact with the decision making at all of these levels is extremely challenging. But what we're going to talk about some of these specific levels, I'm going to switch to physicians in a moment, but I just want to be clear that whatever you do on the physician side, however you set the terms of liability, however you decide this, is going to also be vastly affected by decisions by malpractice insurers, by healthcare payers, by FDA, by all these other parties. And for me as a patient who you're saying, the reason I'm doing this is for your sake, you're really trying to kind of represent that all of these people are well aligned to further my healthcare. And that's just a big undertaking. So liability, I've mentioned this a couple of times. So I'll start with what I think is probably good news, but I'll tell you why maybe it's not so good news. So the good news is, I think people are way more worried about liability for artificial intelligence than they should be based on the existing case law we've seen. Now, first asterisk on top of that, the existing case law we've seen, that's reported cases, right? We'd better to be able to go through all the closed cases and all the claims that have been made for insurance. The second is the level of integration we have so far is on the low end compared to 5 years or 10 years from now. So it would be to be expected that these amounts of claims will go up and the cases that will have reported decisions will go up. But all that said, if you looked at it, and I'll tell you a little bit later about kind of what we see in the corpus of the reported cases, the vast majority of cases, and they're a small number, but within that small number, most of the cases actually, if you factored out the Da Vinci surgical robot, the cases drop dramatically. That actually it's the integration of AI into robotics and surgical robotics that are probably the cases that have generated the most reports. And I think for the most part, people are probably too worried about liability. Now why that's good news for many people in this room. Why it's slightly bad news is if you're expecting malpractice and the tort system to be the thing that ensures the safety and the safety of adoption and slowing us down appropriately, it's probably not doing a lot of that unless just so happens we've gotten it perfect in the Goldilocks world, that we have the exact perfect implementation and the AI we have is wonderful. I'm highly skeptical, but I guess it is possible. Okay. But even though there's very few cases, I can walk you through just a very simple toy cases from a paper we did in JAMA a couple years ago, just to explain how the tort system encounters medical artificial intelligence and what happens. And this toy example we use, very stylized, patient has ovarian cancer. There is a standard of care dose of chemotherapy that the oncologist would do, and the AI recommends for this particular patient a higher dose based on factors that are specific to this patient. And that's part of what the AI is promising us, personalized medicine, make medicine better for this patient, right? Okay, so just take you through this chart briefly, right? And luckily the stoplight at the end is going to be the important stuff, right? But essentially what we assume is that there's one of two recommendations, right? Could be standard of care dosage or non-standard of care dosage. That's the second column. The third column is basically saying, well, perhaps for some reason the higher dosage is better for this patient or it's worse for that patient. So we're treating this as correct or incorrect. Again, very stylized, very simplified. Next column, the physician has the authority, we're assuming, to either follow or not follow the AI recommendation. We could come to a world where that authority is being limbed by the payer, by the malpractice kind of coverage, or by the hospital system themselves, and saying that actually we're going to put guardrails about when you can deviate. Then we've got the patient outcome. And we're just assuming if the physician follows a correct recommendation or rejects an incorrect recommendation, the outcome is good. If the opposite, the outcome is bad. Very stylized toy example. Okay, now we're in that last column with the color coding. Okay, 8 possible situations could occur if you just follow this logic. That's all we've done. First, if there's no injury, there's going to be no liability. That's the green boxes in the figure. That's a good outcome. Now, whether it's a good outcome because it happens that the physician accepts a correct recommendation or rejects an incorrect recommendation, it doesn't matter. There hasn't been an injury, we're happy. Second, though, tort law typically privileges the standard of care regardless of its effectiveness in a particular case. That is, if you follow the standard of care, you are not negligent, whether or not your non-negligent act led to a good or bad outcome. When physicians follow the standard of care, if we have evidence to that effect, and we have a jury that's fair and it's going to hear it, or a judge who's fair that's going to hear it, that should not lead to liability, even though actually departing from the standard of care would have been better for that particular patient. What that means is that essentially, as a physician, your incentive is as follows. When the AI tells me the thing I was going to do, the standard of care, is absolutely correct, I'm going to follow that AI. That's a smart AI. When the AI, though, departs from what I would have done, and it's telling me, here, I'm adding value, I'm telling you to do something a little bit different. If what you care about is avoiding liability, you should stick with the standard of care and ignore what the AI tells you, right? That is the most secure way to practice medicine. But doing so is terrible for your patient's health because we're adopting the AI specifically to capture those cases where the non-standard of care approach is better. So as a result, the liability system kind of causes you to be extremely resistant to AI recommendations unless we do something to upset that equilibrium. What does upsetting that equilibrium look like? Entering a world where failing to use AI and failing to listen to it suddenly becomes a breach of the standard of care, right? If we enter a world where any physician who ignores the AI or doesn't acquire the AI is practicing substandard medicine, that's a whole different picture. Are we likely to get to that world anytime soon? Short answer, no. And this is a feature, I think, of the legal system. The law of medical malpractice has a lot of respect for what's called the distinguished minority view, right? So as long as a substantial number of physicians do it the other way, turns out that is a strong argument you make in medical malpractice litigation. As a result, it requires a large movement to get us to a world where suddenly failing to follow the AI is a violation of the standard of care. And until we get there, there may be not enough incentive for AI adoption if we leave it to individual physicians on themselves. Now, what else can change the equilibrium? Changes in physicians groups, meetings like this where people start talking, results, publications, it can happen. But I want to suggest to you it's a relatively slow process. You shouldn't expect that we're going to get there. Now, are there examples in medicine? You all have medical training. You can think about things they did 50 years ago, ways they did it by hand 50 years ago, that if you did it today, you would be committing malpractice and you'd be a terrible physician. The same is likely to be true in the future with medical AI. But that process is a fairly conservative one when it comes to the courts. And it's going to be tricky to get there. And as a result, I'm not worried about too much liability. I'm worried that actually the current liability system might cause us to be too conservative about the adoption of AI rather than too liberal. And we can talk more about that. We're rapidly entering a space where we don't always know we are dealing with artificial intelligences, right? And this might be in a chatbot interface. This might be behind a recommendation that a physician is making. The last time I saw my physician, the physician made a recommendation to me about a major health problem. Do I know what went into that recommendation, whether AI is involved? Do I have a right to be told that AI has been involved in my care, and under what circumstances, right? If it turns out that I have prostate cancer, I'm facing prostate cancer, and it's a choice between watchful waiting or prostatectomy, and my physician makes a recommendation of watchful waiting, do I have a right to be told that part of what went into that analysis was the decision of a black box AI sold by a vendor, purchased by the hospital system, not understood at all by the physician, but has some reliability to it and others use it, and it's made a recommendation the physician has used on an edge case to make a determination? Is that something the physician has to look me in the eye and tell me as part of this, or not? I find this a very challenging question. I'll give you the way I think about it. On the one hand, if it turns out I was going for surgery and somebody else scrubbed in as the surgeon rather than my surgeon, that would clearly be a case of a violation of informed consent if I wasn't told. Do we think the AI is playing the role of somebody joining the care team and scrubbing in a way, and I'm not told this person's involved? That would suggest lots of obligations to disclose. On the flip side, the last time a pediatrician made a decision about whether to give antibiotics to a particular child who presents with something that might be bacterial, might be viral, right? Or even my physician making a decision about whether to recommend that I get a second opinion or something like that. If it turns out I could actually see into the brain and the synapses of my physician, what might I find in that beautiful black box? I might find things like a vague memory of some old back issues of JAMA or NEJM, a recollection that maybe in medical school somebody mentioned this at one point, a conversation with a colleague maybe 3 weeks ago that was like half remembered, 5 other patients I kind of reminded the physician of, but not exactly right, and some indigestion from what was served at lunch, that these are the things that have motivated one decision rather than the other. We don't ordinarily think that I, as a patient, have a right to have the disclosure of all of that information. Should we think about this as just one more additive to the soup of what leads us to these kinds of decisions? I can tell you, for many patients, they care a lot. If you ask patients, is this material to you? That's the legal standard. They would say, absolutely, doctor, this is the kind of thing that matters a lot. And some of the time, being given that information, they would make the worst choice, having been told that an AI is involved. They'd either be overconfident or underconfident. Does that create the fact that they would want to know an obligation to disclose? Legally, probably not. Legally, this is not a case where you'd probably be sued if you failed to disclose. But ethically speaking, if we're rewriting the laws, what would we want? And does it matter how salient or how important the choice is? I have down here a paper we did for JAMA Pediatrics a little while ago regarding AI as a mental health therapist for adolescents. So this is now a chatbot interface. And there's lots of wonderful things here, things that adolescents are comfortable asking a chatbot about sexuality, about abuse, about all sorts of things they would never feel comfortable talking to a real therapist about, or may not feel comfortable. So a lot of positive things here. Do those adolescents, though, have a right to know that the messages are initially being crafted by an AI, reviewed in theory by someone on the company side, and tweaked a little bit, but not dealing directly with somebody who presents themselves not as a therapist, but really as a kind of mental health kind of advocate or helper for them, an opportunity to chat? One more thing I'll point to, which is this cute little seal here. This is Paro, the therapeutic robot. So many of you deal in gerontology. He's often given to people at the early stage of dementia, and he's a little pet, and he coos, and he responds to them, and he makes the patients very happy, but he's also a little spy. He's constantly collecting information from older patients who may have some sense of what he is, but not a perfect sense of it. And essentially, that's information that's very useful for determining declines. Just as having your Alexa record your speech patterns, we might learn a lot about decline into Alzheimer's and where you are. But if individuals don't understand that they're in the middle of a clinical moment, a clinical encounter, they're sharing this kind of information, to what extent are we respecting their dignity by doing so? Data privacy and consent. So I mentioned earlier, where does all of this data come from? And the short answer is it comes from the patients, but guess what? It also comes from you. So there's the old joke, right? If you can't figure out what the product they're selling is, the answer is you're the product, right? In the sense of much of the large language models are being trained not just on patient data, but on what you do as a physician in a way that's sort of interesting. So unlike the artists or the photojournalists who've made claims over their intellectual property and said, stop taking my intellectual property, we haven't really heard a groundswell of physicians that say, we like the learning healthcare system, but you're learning a lot from me, and what am I getting out of this, and how am I benefiting from it? So I think that's an interesting sociological question about why that might or might not be the case. But as we share patient data as hospital systems, as practices, with big tech companies, all of a sudden we're starting to see lawsuits pop up. This was one against the University of Chicago, and Google was ultimately dismissed for reasons kind of unrelated to legal theory. But one of the claims was, because you had location data and you shared the timestamp on the patient record, it turns out that because you are Google and you have location data on people's phones, you can piece together who these people are in a way that's violative of HIPAA. So we have to think seriously about the kinds of information we are sharing. For those of you who run hospital systems or run practices, right, chances are, if you haven't built a really good sandboxed, firewalled index of ChatGPT or another LLM, what your physicians and your nurses and others are doing is they're taking out their phones using the regular ChatGPT and typing in all sorts of questions. In doing so, they're probably engaging in a ton of HIPAA violations because the prompts themselves reveal lots of information about a patient, right? So one thing to think about is if you are, I don't like this stuff, I want to stay away from it, I don't want to build this in, what you may actually be doing is causing your physicians to be doing this outside your system in a way you have less visibility and less control. This is a diagram from a paper we did a couple years ago. So we tried to show what HIPAA protects, that's the part of the iceberg over the waterline. And then we try to point out all the things that would allow us to make inferences about your health, right? Your Fitbit, your Google searches, your neighborhood, your walking pattern, your gait, all of these things, your Instagram posting and filter choice to try to determine whether you are depressed from those. And we have a health privacy system that's focused very much on what's in the EHR, what's in the covered entity, but pretty much in most states, not focused at all these other things. And we're entering a world where that which best predicts patients' health might not actually be the material in your health record, right? But many other things. And one question is whether, as a design, you as physicians want to have access to all those other things and have them analyzed as part of this, to cross-tabulate not only the things patients tell you and the things they share with you in the test results, but all of this other data from all these other sources in order to try to make really informed decisions for this patient. Would that be a godsend to have that kind of God's eye view about the patient, or would be a terrible kind of instance of a surveillance society that should make you very nervous? Okay. I do want to say another word about bias. At this point, I often say people, if you've been listening closely to this talk, what you've learned is your AI makes a lot of errors that are serious. Your AI is very confident that it's right, even when it's actually 100% wrong, right? Your AI is leaking tons of data. Your AI gives poor explanations and is not very candid about the reasons why it came to a certain conclusion. And I'm going to tell you that your AI is also quite biased. But guess what? So is your physician. So the real question is a comparison of these kinds of two things, right? And whether the two together can do better than just one alone, which is just to say, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And we're really asking ourselves, are we paying attention to the ways in which the workforce together can be designed in such a way to improve on this? So when it comes to bias, as this paper by Nazar shows, there's a ton of different kinds of bias. The easiest one to wrap your head around is missing data bias. An app is built, and I often say, as a white guy, mid-40s in Boston, I'm dead center in every data set used to train medical AI in the US, right? So if the question is the data representative of me? Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, right? But it turns out there's many other people in this country look very different from me, and they may be missing in the data set, right? So that's an easy conception of bias to conceptualize. Hard sometimes to fix, but easy to understand. By contrast, there are many much more subtle and difficult forms of biases that I want to just kind of mention a few here. One is measurement classification bias, where the practitioner's bias is translated into what's in the data set that's being used to train. So women are less likely to receive lipid-lowering medications and procedures in a hospital compared to men, despite being more likely to present with hypertension and heart failure. That measurement bias about what we've measured will get translated into the data set used to train the medical AI. A different example that's easy to miss is called label bias, and Ziad Obermeyer has a great, now I think fairly well-known paper on this subject, looking at a high-risk care management algorithm. And essentially the idea was, can we target the patients who would benefit the most from this kind of high-risk care management and prioritize them? And what they found was, at the same level of sickness, it preferred white patients to black patients. Now the reason, though, is very interesting. Why did the algorithm exhibit a pattern of results that favored white patients over black patients? Turned out, what they parameterized it, what they told the algorithm to optimize, they took as a measure of how sick you were, your cost. They took total health expenditure or costs as the predictor of health needs. A priori, that's not a bad way to design one of these things, right? It's a continuous variable, it's very rich, we have lots of this data. But because we know that black patients and white patients have very different cost curves, even at the same level of sickness, what ends up happening is if you focus on cost and optimize for that, you end up in a situation where the white patients are prioritized over the black patients. Trying to figure out all of those kinds of biases that might be in the system is very difficult. Trying to do it continuously over time as the algorithm changes and learns, even more difficult. And trying to do it honestly, extremely difficult. So just to say this is a persistent challenge, and one that I think there's no silver bullet for, just the kind of thing that I think you have to start thinking about at the moment you start building, rather than the back end to say, we designed this, is there a problem on race? Is there a problem on gender? Is there a problem on age? It's instead thinking at each step along the way, how are these problems likely to curb it? I will say maybe one more thing and then I'm going to stop, which is to say there are a bunch of obstacles to liability. So I told you, actually very few of the lawsuits we've had have gone forward. And let me just briefly tell you why. When you try to sue a developer, the developer is going to argue it's not a product, it's not product's liability, it's an intangible. If it's been FDA reviewed, they're going to argue maybe it's preempted, your state tort suit is preempted by the FDA clearance. They're going to say, tell me the reasonable alternative design that would have prevented the error you have in mind. And they're going to have an opportunity to point the finger at different responsible parties to say, well, actually, this was a perfectly good designed product. It was used very poorly by the physicians, or the hospital system screwed up the implementation. All of this makes it very difficult and very expensive to bring one of these lawsuits, which makes it hard to think as a malpractice lawyer it's something you want to bring. When it comes to the physician, and I'll stop here, also there's a bunch of defenses we're seeing run in the literature and the case law that are relevant. Difficulty in showing that the acceptance or departure of the AI recommendation was unreasonable. So the physician made a decision to follow or to depart. Getting an expert witness out there who can specify why that was unreasonable, quite difficult. Foreseeability of the model output was inappropriate for a particular patient. If the argument is to say it's a good model, just not for this patient, you have to show that it should have been foreseeable to the physician that it would have been an inappropriate for a particular patient. Problems demonstrating causation. You have to show not only that had the model been better and made a different recommendation, not only would the physician have followed it, but had the physician followed it, a different care outcome would have occurred. That's difficult to do. And finally, just the difficulty in accessing enough information about the algorithm's design and operation to write your complaint in the first place and survive a motion to dismiss. So these are some of the things we're seeing in literature already in the very few cases that have been brought that have caused them to be dismissed. And this is one of the things that's been an obstacle to many people, even if you are a malpractice lawyer. If you can go for a much simpler case, why pick this very difficult case that's going to be very complex to bring? Thank you very much.